So I'm here with Jed and Jason, who has Jason Almond Tree. He has his own channel. He's also a longtime listener of Grail Country, and he approached me because he's heard us talk about evolution of consciousness from time to time, and he had some questions about that. And he also wanted to talk to Jed. So I know we're going to start with talking about evolution of consciousness, but I don't know where it's going to go from there. We'll see what happens. But so go ahead, Jason. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, yeah, I just it came up because I was watching, I can't remember which video it was where you two were talking back and forth. And the video I don't think was even around that whole topic, but you guys kind of briefly mentioned it in passing. And I was just like, what the heck is this idea? Because it's just I wanted to ask you about it because it feels like it's something that I've kind of had in the back of my mind for years now. But I never hear anybody talk about it in church because I got the sense it's related to theosis, right? Would you say or no?
Yeah, in a way, kind of like in the Barfield's idea is that consciousness begins in original participation, which is what you see reflected in like the consciousness of humanity essentially before the axial revolution, right? So before the development of Greek philosophy or Hebrew monotheism. So, and also we're still reflected in the consciousness of indigenous peoples, like even up to contemporary times. Like there essentially there's no awareness of the solitary I, or the strict division between I and world that you have post-enlightenment in our age. And that essentially, like, since the actual revolution, this like withdrawal of the original participatory consciousness has gotten more and more advanced, but that it never recedes entirely. Like there's always a remnant of it, and that the goal is to move toward final participation, which is a kind of a reintegration. So like after we've gained this sort of modern ego consciousness that has this sort of like observer viewpoint, finding a way to integrate that along with the older participatory consciousness toward what Barfield calls final participation. And he does kind of tend to put that in eschatological terms. So I would say that one could argue that that is part of what's involved in theosis, is that reintegration of consciousness. I would say you can see this kind of motif a little bit in some of the way that Ian McGilchrist talks about the difference between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain too, because I would say that the consciousness of withdrawal of participation is pretty much exactly identical to the way McGilchrist describes a dysfunctionally, lopsidedly left brain view of the world. That there's a lot of alignment there. So there's a tangential relation. And then I would also say you can see this process mirrored within human development. I don't know if you saw any of our series on Douglas Harding's The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth. But when Harding talks about like the stages of life, you can see this like on an individual level in the way we develop, where the child has a much more participatory consciousness that is much more rooted in that kind of original participation. And as we develop, our civilization's withdrawal kind of like takes hold and we're brought within to the dominant worldview. But that the sage in the Harding kind of view would be representative of someone who has come back and reintegrated that, right? Where there's no longer, they are no longer solely identifying with just the person they see in the mirror as being the absolute residence of their I.
Okay. That makes sense. So do you
I
think,
said a lot, so I'm sure
yeah,
that I need to unpack some of that, but I'm trying to just give as broad an overview as I can as to what I'm thinking of when we talk about that kind of thing.
yeah, it's really interesting. It's a lot more, I think, in depth than I even had in mind. And the way you have, clearly you guys have thought about it a lot more than I have. Do you think even watching it, like you said, it happens in the child, happens in everybody's personal life. Um, so that can kind of map on to like Adam as humanity or something? Like you're
I
saying?
think, yeah, actually you can. That's a really great observation. I would say that's something that's kind of like you see Adam in the Edenic consciousness. Adam is definitely in a state of original participation. You know, God is walking him in the garden, and you can't. I think you actually can map the fall onto like the dawning of this ego consciousness, that's becoming more pronounced,
Yeah.
and obviously the consciousness of final participation, if it's an integrated consciousness, is going to be a consciousness that is more in the mode of what you see in Christ. I think you can do that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I think it's kind of in Isaiah, there's a I think it talks about the harlot Babylon. She says that those are, well, in Isaiah, God's got this refrain. He keeps saying, I am, and there's none besides me. And then
Mm.
harlot Babylon shows up in one of the chapters. She says the same thing. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's so it's kind of that, I guess, egoic thing where you're declaring, where you're declaring yourself as, you see yourself, I guess. Do you think that's necessary though in the process of this evolution of consciousness? Probably.
It's an interesting question because I think in a sense, I mean, if you end up wading into some really interesting theological waters, like if you say that it's a necessary component of theosis or necessary part of the development of consciousness, is almost like a false start or a sketch that then gives way to the real thing. I'm comfortable saying that yes, it was if it's not necessary, it was an inevitability of the development of consciousness, right? Is that the image comes, like the sketch comes and then the final work is introduced after the sketch kind of thing. And I think that like there is a sense where the first positing of the self, of the I am, right? So for me, I am Jed, right? Is going to be a false start, right? Because I'm going to look in the mirror and I'm going to associate what I am as an individual as is really bound within my own psychological self-perception, right? And the egoic I, and that I has to be transcended, right? So there's a sense where it's like you're building up the scaffolding into self-identity, only to realize that the self that you're identifying as is not necessarily a false self, but is not the complete self, right? And so it has to pass through another threshold. And I think that that's really what gets revealed in Christ, right? Is he does cross that threshold through this act of kenosis, of the self-emptying. And in his self-emptying, he's disclosing the true nature of the self, right? So that he has a rightful claim upon the name I am.
Right.
And
Because
he can claim that in an unqualified sense, where let's say the whore of Babylon can make that self-positing claim, not entirely false in the context of Isaiah, right? That she's has a characterization or self-identity, but she's greatly mistaken as to what her true nature actually is, which I think gets explored
right.
with like probably no author explored it better than George MacDonald and Lilith, as far as like the kind of the whore of Babylon, what she really is, right? And her own confusion about her own the true nature of her own self and her selfhood. And so I do think that there is an element of inevitability that our first sense of self, or the first Adam, has to give way to the new man, to the new human being. And so there's a progression there that I'm comfortable saying is necessary. I know some people may not, but I think that when I look at those kinds of the question of like, how do you develop like conscious beings that have a real history and have like a kind of a psychological realism, is there has to be that first stage, which in a sense is the precondition of the second, right?
Yeah.
And so, that's kind of, I don't know if that gets at anything significant, but it is certainly something that I think is important, is that first movement of consciousness is going to, you cannot stay there.
Well, I think I'm comfortable saying it was maybe necessary as well, but is the reason you think people might be hesitant towards that is because it would be associated with the fall, so it's kind of saying
Right.
the fall is necessary. And
Yeah,
I could see where.
I think that some people have a real problem with that. I have less of a problem with it. But I'm also, that's not something that I'm gonna sit there and make a full-throated defense of. That's just an intuition that I have, that it's like, no, this had to happen this way in order to have free creatures. Like there had to, the possibility the possibility had to give way to necessity. Like it was an inevitability that one creature would fall, and as a result, all fall.
Well, in order to be real creatures with the kind of history that you were talking about, right? There really isn't any other option.
Right. Well, and Tolkien brings up that point, and have you read the Silmarillion?
No, I have not. No.
Okay, so
I'm not very well rounded in reading. So.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, I'm kind of a book nerd, so but he has this really fascinating letter, and it's in a publication of his letters, but he's really pretty adamant that you don't have history until you have a fall. Mm-hmm. And so his whole retelling of kind of the early mythology of Middle Earth is really a retelling, this mythological retelling of the fall in the context of Middle Earth. And so we don't have history, we don't have story without.
Why is that exactly? Is it because we need the idea of suffering for it?
Well, because the alternative is stasis. The alternative is stasis. Like I would say to have story, you also need to have time. And I think there's definitely a link between time and the fall. Like for there to be becoming at all, that, and for that to have any kind of like real freedom, then I don't see any evasion of that necessity for fall. And I can, and just think of like, what kind of narrative could you possibly have without that reality? Like we couldn't tell any stories at all.
Well, yeah, I would.
Things have been this way forever and will always be this way for all time. I mean,
well, narrative structure, like you can't, like in any good storytelling, like you have to introduce the problem and the conflict. Then you get the rising action, the climax and resolution, right? That's the basic story arc of every story that we've ever told.
Yeah.
And like, so I think it's so deeply ingrained into our conscious awareness that I think almost every story recapitulates in some sense the fall.
Okay.
Right. But here's the thing though, Jed. Now here's the interesting bit, is that over identification with that story of thinking that your I am is limited to the character that you are in your own head is also is going to keep you from moving toward final participation, I would say, because you have to at some point reach the point where you relink your story with the other stories and see how they are connected. Does that make any sense at all?
Oh yeah, I feel like this is just branching off into a lot of different ideas for me right now.
Okay,
So
that's fine. I'm totally fine with that.
Well, take us on one of the adventures, Jason. I'm curious to see like what.
Well, because so the idea of not having the fall and that being there not being much of a story there. I personally, I feel like I resonate with that, and even thinking about the new heavens and new earth, I like the idea of further up and further in like that. But then I do have a friend, and he said there are a lot of people where it seems like they don't like that idea. They kind of like a conclusion, and it comes in and it's just like everything's right, just everything's set, and it feels to me like stasis. But he said,
yes,
but my friend said we don't need to think of this as stasis. Like he made that emphasis, and so for some reason to him it doesn't come across that way. And I don't know if to some people it comes across as like a Sabbath, a shalom, a rest or something.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
I'm
the
not really
two.
sure.
No, that is like, so that's the two. That's the two basic ideas that we have of the eschaton, right? We have like this idea of Sabbath, of shalom, of peace and rest, and then we have this idea of, the kind of further up and further in. And I would say that the theology throughout most of the history of the, at least in Western theology, the stasis or repeated stasis model has been the dominant view, and I think it's wrong.
It bothers me. I don't like it. But yeah, but I'm like, there is the eighth day too, right? I mean, there's a seventh day, but
Right.
there's an eighth day, and that's when you get a circumcised, you get a new name. And so it's like there's a new beginning in that, I feel like.
It doesn't seem to, the problem is I think it's a, I don't think it's a proper representation of, I think it's a failure. It's a failure of imagination and thinking about both about eternity and about the infinite.
Well, I
Yeah.
think, yeah, and I think it kind of, that brings up a few different associations. I'll throw a couple out and just see where they land, right? So if you think of it in terms of like an octave structure, right? And that you have 7 days within that octave structure that repeat just like they do in a musical octave, right?
Mhm.
So the 8th day is just the recapitulation and the ordering of the new system, right? And so it's in a sense it's the 1 and the 7 that kind of come together in this new living reality. And I think that the whole concept, and I think that there's always been kind of the tendency in Christian metaphysics to look at that final eschatological state as stasis, right? And but I think that there's also another strand that you see like in Gregory of Nyssa, which is like the epictasis, the ever outstretching. So kind of the further up, further in kind of concept. And I think that really you kind of need both elements, right? And that's, I think, the only way that creatures can embody the divine infinity is from that state of essential rest. So our nature is at rest in God, right? But it is constantly moving, just like God's rest is constantly moving because he's pure act. God is always in the act of being God to the fullest extent that God is God, which is to say infinite, right? So there's that stasis, but it's always moving. It's not an inactive stasis. And so for the creature is, being joined finite to infinite, like we are in Christ, who's joining the finite created nature to the infinite uncreated nature, is that it allows creaturely movement to come from that place of divine rest, right? So that we're constantly being impelled on because we're tapped into the infinite source of all things, and constantly at rest, but always always in motion. And right, so the motion is always further into God.
Right, and that would be to conceive of an I am that is outside the story.
Well, or that a different story is being told. It's not the story that we assume that history is kind of has this narrative arc, and that's really the sum total of all things. When in reality, it's like history itself is kind of the scaffolding to the real story,
right?
That is always present and available to us. And it's that story of like ultimate reconciliation, or that state where God is all in all. That is actually the case
right.
now.
So the story that connects to all stories.
Right. But
which would be the true I am, as opposed to the character that you are in your head when you're talking to yourself.
It's a hard thing to grasp, because it's like, if God's infinite, how's I can see it working as like a pattern, like a perpetual pattern of stories connecting to stories, continual reconciliation.
Mhm.
But like if he's infinite, I don't ever see this point of like just this, because if like it said, it feels like stasis. If all comes and all, it's just like said and done or something like that. Like I feel like it's a motion. That's how it seems to work in my head. I don't know if I can explain it right. I've tried to explain it before. Like if we're talking about the story in Genesis, and if Genesis is kind of what we want to get back to, this Edenic state or whatever, it's like, I mean, you have to ask yourself, was it better before the fall? Because was Adam just walking on eggshells the whole time? Like, I mean, if you have a kid and it's never messed up, like, is the fall better now so that way we could actually really, really bite off that chunk of forgiveness in Christ that we needed to really know love. And so if that's like a pattern going into all stories, it's like this continual, how it works in my head is just the Psalm 136 is mercy endures forever, is mercy endures forever. It's like everything finite, everything in the left side of the brain thinking, like every time that happens, it's kind of I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it. I always say it's just truth sitting on the mercy seat, like it is in Exodus. It's like truth being in the womb, like it's encompassed in mercy. So any finite thing, I'm trying to think of how this maps on to like the in the new heavens, new earth. It's just like every time you get an idea and everything, something like there's a truth in your head or an ideal, it's like it comes to a point where it has to become the martyr or something like that. You know, it has to die and become mercy in order to include the other, right? I think I heard you mention this in the conversation with Luke a while back. It's like everything has to become the martyr. So if that's kind of the pattern, and that's the pattern Christ set for us, I just see that as repeating continually, and it's continually drawing, like that's what will draw other people to you, because you get your perception of yourself, you see who you are, and then you kind of have to die to yourself constantly to be able to forgive other people and to be able to continually pull people back in to your own personal relationship, to pull the stories together, to reconcile things. But then how does that work in the new heavens and new earth? Does that just continually repeat and they spread out? Do we just continually keep repeating the story or something?
Well,
let's
I
ask
think it's different than like the Stoics kind of had that idea that it does. It's just a repeating the universe. You know, you have, well, to put it in modern terms, singularity collapses on itself and starts again. Right.
This
And
would
cycle
not
starts.
just the Stoics, like that's like that is the dominant ancient view of is that you have that it's just repeating cycles. That would be the Hindu view too. Like that would,
yeah. But I think that I think like modern mathematical discoveries kind of lead us out of that quandary in a way, is that like if you look at fractal geometry as a kind of the metaphysical analog to that, right, is that you have it's never the same story, but it's variations on a theme and an ever outstretching proliferation of that theme. And it's an unfolding of the theme, right? So, I mean, my physics and my metaphysics both allow for no unrealized possibility, right? So I think that all possible worlds are actual worlds at some point, right? So I think that my personal view, and I would be willing to defend this, at length, but that we will get to a point where our cosmos, this world, what we view as our cosmos, its story completes, right? And we enter into that stasis of the New Jerusalem. But from that stasis, I see the new themes emerging, right? And new stories being told. Now, we, from a vantage point of having become fully divinized, participate in that story in a different way than the new participants and new entrants into that story. But I see an everlasting outstretching proliferation of every possible world. And so it's just a fractal unfolding of the finite into the infinite, if that makes sense.
I have two questions and neither of them are easy questions, but I'm
going to reload on some coffee here, so I'm listening.
Okay. First of all, Jed, I would like for you to tell me what a possible world is.
Okay.
because I'm not sure that I think that's a thing. And I'm not saying that you're wrong. I cannot see a possible world as anything. I could,
Okay.
like, so I need you to flesh out the concept of a possible world for me a little bit more before I would buy into
Gonna
the
tell us-
idea of possible worlds.
Okay.
And then the other question I have is, like, maybe it's worth asking, well, had there not been a fall, what would Adam have been doing?
Okay.
Making out with Eve. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Sorry. That was after.
Okay.
the
So
fall.
that first, to the second issue, that's really not something that I spend too much time occupied with, because I actually look at that as an impossibility.
I do too, but I think in order for us to understand this, I think it's weird because it's very weird that I'm doing this, because I'm also the person at the same time who's like resisting the idea of possible worlds. So,
Okay.
and I realize the contradiction inherent in that, me questioning possible worlds, and then also wanting to engage in a thought exercise regarding if Adam hadn't fallen, what would he have been doing in the garden? But I think that there's almost no other way of framing this idea of stasis or repeated stasis versus epistasis when you're talking about the eschaton. There has to, like, we have to like address that.
Okay.
Because
Yeah. Well, I think the first question is a little bit, it's actually much simpler than, at least in my mind, it's a fairly simple exercise, right? Just taking kind of the basic Platonic premise that being is transparent to thought, right? So there can be no being that is not somewhat apprehensible to thought, right? And so if
being is intelligible.
Yeah, the intelligibility of being, or like Eric Pearl, the great philosopher, metaphysician, would talk about it as thinking being, right? Or thinking through the implications of being, is that that there is no.
But there's only a requirement, but that would only require that which has been actualized.
And so I it's pretty simple.
Would be intelligible.
Right. So anything that is conceivable, right? So anything that has like some sort of conceptual reality to it. Possibility is a bad word, right? It really is. It comes out of analytic philosophy, and I don't hold to like the analytic model of possible worlds. I think they're all actual, right? Now, the point in time where they're actualized, I don't have any opinion on that. But if something is rationally possible, right? So if something
not a contradiction. So you're not talking about something like a squared circle. You're talking about something that is conceivable,
an object of real thought, right? So if that object, like if I can imagine an object that has, the basic qualifications of being, namely that it's transparent to thought, it can be rationally conceived of, discussed, its properties made known through rational inquiry, and that object of rational thought does not exist in this world, then it would necessarily exist in another world, right? And to back that up into just the discussion of the nature of the relationship between the finite and the infinite, because all possibilities are already, in a sense, actualized in the infinite, there will be an infinite sequence of actualization, right? So all real possibilities find an ontological ground of being in the real world, in the finite world, or worlds, right? And so you can't. So if I can conceive of a dragon, right? A dragon may not exist in this world, but there will be a world in which dragons exist, right? Because they would bear the marks of perfectibility. And that would be like the one qualifying point, is that I don't think we can conceive of any being without also positing that being can be perfectible, which would mean that its final stasis is union with God.
Yeah, I don't know about that, because like you would give like real existence to all kinds of unimaginable evils that could be imagined. Like
You would,
you would say that all of those
yes,
things are actualized.
it's all ventured in creation, right? And all of that has to ultimately be resolved in an apokatastasis, in a restoration. But yes, I mean, in a sense, like, while evil itself has no necessity, like, you know, monsters by necessity must be restored, right? So if somebody conceives of a monster, it can't have real being unless it has some sort of original goodness to which it must return, right? So you can't imagine like a purely
I think that God, I think one can safely posit that God only actualizes the good.
yeah, but the evil, like,
So that means that there can't be infinite possible worlds, because you can imagine things which are potencies that God would not actualize.
no, because if a being has if a being has a potential toward being unified with God, then that being has to exist in order for the manifold infinite perfections to be displayed in all being, right? And so I realize that's kind of a technical metaphysical statement.
Oh yeah, we got deep. Yeah, we got deep in the weeds, metaphysical weeds, a while back on this one.
Yeah, and
Let me withdraw my question, because we could literally spend the rest of the time talking about this.
yeah,
I'm fine
did
with
write
that.
some
I don't
stuff on
know.
that. But the sense here is like, essentially, to put a practical point on the question, is those things will arise out of our co-creative activity as the body of Christ.
But then I have a question then. So if that, and you're saying that would be in the, that's called the Eschaton, right? New heavens, new earth, after all that. Okay, so then would there be a continual pattern of falling and redemption then? Because you're saying
there would be like I said, variations on a theme. So like, if the fall has occurred in one world, it has occurred in all worlds.
Okay.
It's touched
So
that.
okay, so it's like, yeah, I think I'm thinking some sort of linear time right now, and that's what's tripping me up a little bit too. Yeah, so it's already okay. I think I see what you're saying.
Right. So because the fall occurred in our world, it would have occurred in every world. Like that's the scope. That's the scope of the fall.
But then this gets into something weird too that I don't know. I was about to ask it earlier, but it'd probably get taken off somewhere weird. Like you mentioned time and space earlier, and I mentioned this to Luke Thompson because I've thought about this briefly, but I didn't know if where time and space kind of come into being, is that something does it come from attention or like focus and things like that? And so then if you are focusing or giving attention to these new possible worlds, this new in infinity type thing, would it at some point bring them into time and space, or will time just continually be in this realm of past, present, and future all in one? And something I can't really wrap my head around fully right now. Does that even make sense, that question?
I mean, I think that time and space are kind of a part of the natural outworking of the divine ecstasy of creation itself, right? It's so like the Hebrew term for salvation, yesha, right? To save. If you get into like the etymology of the word itself, one of the curious things that comes out is that it means to make space for something, to create space for it. And in a sense, that act of salvation is almost functionally indistinguishable from the act of creation itself.
Yeah. Right? Okay, that makes sense.
Is that the ecstasy of the divine love that is the creative power undergirding all things is of like such infinite productivity that it makes space for all things. And by, because the nature of that love is infinite, the outstretching of that expression will also stretch into the infinite, right? It just is a ceaseless vault of creation. But it begins with, the ecstasy of that inter-Trinitarian love, right? That moves outside of itself as a necessary expression of itself. And then, in a sense, images itself forth into the whole of the creation. And so, yeah, I think that the outstretching of not only the individual in that epic static outstretching of further up, further in, is actually also an experience of the cosmos itself as it grows and develops and becomes, in a sense, that ever unfolding story of the divine love. And so I think that where I draw the necessity of like an infinite creation is simply that it's, that's the only fitting way to speak of the infinite love of God, is that it's infinitely productive of that which it loves. So that there's no ultimate limit or end to. Now, each world may come to its end point, may come to its eschatological conclusion, but then then it takes on a different role in the life of the unfolding of the worlds that follow. What that is exactly, I don't know, but I would say like we're involved in that story as well, in co-creation.
It's definitely compelling to me. I mean, that's what I mean. I
To use a crude metaphor, we bring our little sketches and drawings to God, and he puts them on his refrigerator and he gives them life and being, right?
Yeah.
And a place for those things to flourish.
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, because it just, if God's wanting to make us as co-creators, wanting to draw humanity, like we're supposed to reflect his image, then it would be, I mean, I like how you mentioned that earlier, that salvation is like the act of creation, or at least has to be, it's making space for that.
And how would you know how to co-create if you didn't have a history and a process of learning and a process and a development that led you to the point where you could create in a responsible way?
Yeah. That's why I thought, this has come to, I mean, I've thought about this for a while. It's probably not that profound or anything, but the part in Revelation where it says, I saw thrones and they sat on them and judgment was committed to them. And it's like the ones that would be on the judges are the ones that are, like you're talking about, the ones that are merciful or something, where they have participated in this salvation. So they know what it is that makes space. They know that it is through Christ that all things, that it is through that pattern that all things, that's how things are created, and not only created but held together. Yeah, and sustained.
Yeah. And I also want to back up too, for anybody that's listening, like I realize like my view is probably an extreme minority. But I can't, my own thinking on that has been probably too inflected by too much science fiction. But like, I think that we take, sometimes you take the cold.
Well, you definitely said, I think like for what you're saying to be true, like, I think that your God is no longer actus purus, if you're right. God would also have to contain potency.
He does in us.
Because there would be no other way of logically conceiving the possibility of infinite possible worlds, because something has to actualize them.
Well, God has to, but I mean, in terms of like, if he's infinite and he's infinitely actual, he's infinite act or pure act,
right,
then there really is no limit on the ways in which that act is actualized. To place a final number is to basically say that there's an end point at which God's activity in creation ceases.
right.
And I don't think that it does. I don't think that that's possible.
I'm not suggesting an endpoint. I'm just saying that
what would the alternative be? That's my question is, okay, then what is the alternative but some sort of just kind of immobile stasis? At some point the motion ends in creation.
I see what you're saying. So what you're saying is that if you're going to have like an eschatological model of epistasis, then it necessarily requires this infinite actualization of possible worlds. Otherwise, there would be no possibility of that kind of eschaton, right? It would have to be, you'd have to posit some sort of like repeated stasis or stasis instead.
Right. And those are the
Right.
questions that Origen and Evagrius are really wrestling with.
Right.
Right. Do we go into like this eternal recurrence? Right. And I just think that the metaphysical reasoning had not opened up. And I think that that's where some of the modern findings of like a,
Well, the pre-Christian world is pretty emphatically aligned in thinking that it is it's a cycle of repetition. Like you can pretty much look at any mythological system you want.
Mhm.
Right. And so this would have now here, I want to bring this back around to what we asked about participation, right? And of evolution of consciousness. So note that the consciousness of original participation actually did not conceive of what you're talking about. It didn't. Its default religious view was the one of repeated cycle. So
Because
there's something
thing in
about the development of this ego consciousness and the withdrawal of participation that has led to the conception of a new possibility within the religious imagination of humanity that did not exist prior to that change in consciousness.
Well, and I think that maybe like, how about this? Like, just in terms of like, if you were to illustrate that with like kind of the cyclical view, the circular view of time that was so like predominant in the ancient world, and then the linear view of time that is so predominant now and has been in modernity, is like we discussed this in like our last discussion, Nate, is like,
Yeah.
I think that the kind of the synthesis between the two is the spiral.
Yes. Well, I was going to say, well, I also wanted to link it to the last discussion we had on Meditations on the Tarot when we talked about the closed circle versus the open circle. It seems to me that the idea that it's just an endless repetition is very much the closed circle idea, right? Which is why the religious imagination was limited to different kinds of solutions. So like you would want to escape it entirely, for example, through Buddhist thinking, you have the idea of just, escape from it entirely, because it is just an endless cycle, an endlessly repeating cycle. So the idea is to escape the cycle. So it's very much a closed circle notion, whereas what you're suggesting is very much an open circle or spiral notion.
I mean, I like it.
As Tomberg says, is like the image of the spiral or the open circle is like the entryway to infinity.
Right. And well, and like you see that kind of echoed in like the Mandelbrot set, right? Mm-hmm. So that kind of that fractal image of the thumbprint of God that they call it, right? As you zoom in, it unfolds and it just keeps going. There is no endpoint to the Mandelbrot set. Right. It is just it's an expression of some very simple mathematical themes, like in terms of how simplicity gives rise to complexity in chaos theory is essentially what that's describing. And what it does is it produces geometrical designs that follow a certain pattern of self-similarity. So there's similarity, but there's not absolute identity. Right. So it opens up into this ceaseless opening of new vistas, right? Mathematically speaking, of these new fractal designs. And I look at that as kind of in a sense, an icon of creation. Not so much like a direct depiction of who God is in the divine infinity, which is beyond even that. But that is what is upheld and cradled within the divine infinity, is this ceaseless unfolding and variation of some very simple themes that give rise to the shape and structure of reality itself. And so I think that like somewhat like that withdrawal of participation that allows us to make those distinctions that we couldn't make in original participation is that necessary fall, right, into a world that is distinct, into the world of good and evil, so to speak, east of Eden. We have to go east of Eden in order to return to Eden, right? But it's transfigured. That whole pattern gets transfigured once we understand what it is in the final participation, which is like being able to create from a real sense of history with the real sense of what the stakes in creation are.
But it's become evident to me. What's become evident to me that I actually was not able to see until we had this conversation was that in order to even for the religious imagination to even be able to see, I would say it's more to see. To me, imagination is spiritual sight. In order for us to be able to see this new possibility, this new horizon within a religious imagination, like that process was necessary. Like it actually would have been impossible for our ancestors to see.
Right.
Which some might use as a basis for rejecting it.
In what way do you think? Like, on what basis would somebody possibly reject? I mean, I'm sure there's probably people who are listening and are disagreeing, but like, what's the alternative?
I just people who have a tendency toward toward trusting that which is old and reliable and traditional and trustworthy, and being suspicious of that which is new or innovative. Like it seems to me like, like, I mean, if you look at like well, I mean, like why did Rene Guénon not become a Christian, right? Why did he stay devoted to the oldest, most conservative metaphysics in his thought? So I think there's certain temperaments that are going to want to look at what is the oldest and the most stable and the most reliable because of that antiquity and stability.
Yeah, well, God bless them for it, because they become almost a part of the unfolding story, right? As the contrast through which the new emerges, right? So even Guénon serves a very important function in the
as a critic of modernity, yeah.
Well, and even in the areas where maybe like our metaphysical thinking might eclipse his own,
right
is not to say that he's wrong,
right
is much to say that, well, as right as he is, that's still
yeah, I don't think that's the right view. To say that the ancients were wrong is definitely the wrong view.
Yeah,
it's like, I just think just as we cannot from our standpoint of consciousness, just as we cannot understand how pneuma was a single word in ancient Greek meaning breath, spirit, and wind, and that these were not conceptually separate the way they are for us, just as we can't conceive of that, I think it's also true that the ancients could not have conceived of these kinds of like non-repeated eschatological concepts, like where there's something more than just a cycle of repetition, or an eternal peace, or some other kind of stasis. I don't think it's conceivable.
Yeah.
Maybe it was. I don't know. You certainly don't. I mean, when do you first, like, I mean, Gregory of Nyssa is like definitely well past the axial age, right? 4th century.
Mm-hmm.
Can anyone think of any examples of that kind of eschatological vision in any system, in any mythology or any religious system prior
But
to that?
he's doing, like, he's bringing in a real innovation in the whole concept of the infinite.
Yeah, that's what yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I can't think of anybody that predates him, even in the Christian world, who was thinking through the nature of the infinite in a way that kind of opened up new vistas.
Well, even in early axial thought, the infinite was viewed with suspicion, right? So for like the ancient Greeks, it's like there was even an evasion of using the term infinite. like indefinite was like
Mm.
the preferred term usually. So for Euclid, like for Euclid, there's not an infinite number of points on a line. There's an indefinite number of points on a line.
Right.
So there's even a skepticism of infinity as a concept. Whereas for us, it's kind of like, I mean, not that we really understand it because it's still beyond our comprehension, but it's certainly not something we have no aversion to it. We talk about it all the time as if we understood it, even though we couldn't conceivably have any idea what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. I got to step away for a second. I apologize here. I'll be right back.
Okay.
All right.
All right, Jason. Sorry, we've been talking a lot without.
No, it's just, I mean, it's fascinating. It's just like everything you guys are saying, I think it registers and makes sense. I just feel like, I just keep thinking, man, there's just, it sounds incredibly lofty, but I'm like, there's got to be a really easy way to perceive it. And I understand the whole closed circle idea that you've mentioned, like you guys were talking about before. That that doesn't seem right to me. That just seems like the Ouroboros or whatever, and it seems like
Ouroboros,
that would
yeah.
just that way of stasis would just continually. To me, it would almost just shrink, like continually, just eventually,
Right.
just consume itself. So I liked when was it Michael or was it it was one of you three? Then you mentioned the birth.
Mhm.
And that's the breaking of the circle, that's opening it back
Yeah.
up again. And so I
Yeah.
thought that was a good way to describe it. And I was even thinking of like cities, because I was thinking about while you guys were talking, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. I guess we imagine it, and even the Garden of Eden, it's like a walled garden, right? So it's kind of, in a way, it's a closed circle, but then you have daughter villages. Like you have, in order to have any sort of exploration, like you have that birth and the gates open, and this one leaves his father and his mother and goes out and is joined to the new wife potentiality, the new feminine, and then reproduces. So it is like, I don't know, that's kind of how it's mapping out in my head. You have it on the really personal level in a family. It's just birth is like the opening of the circle, opening of the womb, opening of the, and then it's creation through that. And then, but then it even maps out to the kingdom of heaven or whatever kingdom you want. It expands that way of going out into further potentialities. So I see it like progressing up that pattern, like you're talking about. And it is I think the spiral image makes a lot more sense to view it that way. But also the other image that came to my mind, and I don't know if this is helpful. Have you ever seen like the flower of life thing that they draw? You know what I'm talking about? Where
Mhm.
it's just, okay, yeah, and it's like a point or circle or something, and then there's a circle around it, and then that circle goes out and it makes another circle and another circle, and it's like continually expanding or something like that. To where it's not even in that, it's not necessarily a closed circle. It's like a new point to then creates another space, like you're talking about another womb or something like that, and then it'll do that again and create another womb and continue through. So I don't know what I'm getting at. I guess that's just what's mapping onto my head in terms of new heavens and new earth, and going into all of that would be something like that. It doesn't, the thought of stasis kind of is, I don't want to say terrifying, but frustrating for sure. So, and it seems to just devour imagination and almost destroy hope in a way, if you have this close circle.
Yeah, and I think that that's an important point, Jason, because I think that it's like imagination and hope are intimately connected, right? And you can even look in kind of like in our contemporary setting, kind of the anti-birther kind of narrative right now of like, why would I bring a child into this world that is so imperiled, right? It's a signifier of a fundamental loss of hope that is destructive of just the creativity of the imagination itself. And so in that, and I'm not saying like for people who don't want to have kids that they're all guilty of this or something like that, but I think just as a broad phenomenon, what it signifies to me is that there is a general malaise and a lack of hope that the world can be more than what it is now. They can be different or other or better even. And I think that the spirit of creativity, which is, I think, the primary expression of the divine image within us, has to, like, it feeds off of hope, and a hope that is also certain, right? A hope that has a certain fixed point, that point that doesn't move, or the ever moving stillness kind of hope that is in God, and that the to me, like, that the story never ends, right? It's just it's an infinite unfolding of new creative horizons to be realized. And so I think that that the world as we're in it today, and I think still, like, struggling to emerge out of that withdrawn participation, is like, it seems like that circle is closed and people can't imagine anything beyond the horizon that we currently exist in. And I think that that's something that, like, the scriptures are actually pointing us beyond, right? The whole of the book of Revelation is pointing us beyond that horizon, right? Beyond the apocalyptic horizon into a world where the hope is renewed, and the in a sense, the eternal covenant is renewed, right? And that becomes the impetus through which new possibilities can come into being in a new state of affairs. And so I think that, like, that creativity, the hopefulness that is inherent to it, is something that has to be kind of contended for in a world that lacks hope, right? And I think that ties into some of the things that Nate and I've been talking about in our discussions. A lot of our discussions are in the book of Revelation. We did Emil Bock's commentary. Now we're working through Bulgakha, but that is kind of the song of the 144,000.
Part 2 is coming, promise.
It is, yeah. We took a break from it today so that we could have this conversation, which is awesome.
Oh, we can go into it. Let's go there.
But yeah, and so, like, the song of the 144,000 is the creative act of God's people assembled, and having that clear sense of who God is disclosed in Christ becomes the kind of that singular note that then we play off of, right? It's the master key, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then once we get into that stage, then it's just a matter of the actual imagination of God's people collectively, like, aggregating, across, all kinds of individuals and all kinds of spaces, becomes the launching point into that new world, right? It becomes actualized as we imagine it.
I just want to interrogate myself on something that I said about we only have so much recorded history, and when I talk about the religious imagination of the ancients, I'm really thinking mostly about axial age religious ideas. But given the antiquity of the spiral as a religious symbol, if the spiral is the proper image of the kind of epistatic and infinite possibility, that suggests that I was wrong. And if we go far back enough, it was conceivable, because it's actually, the spiral is one of the oldest religious symbols that we have. It goes back to at least the Neolithic period. Mm-hmm. So I just want to correct myself on that. So let's say it was beyond the imaginings. It was beyond the imaginings of the axial age, where you have the beginnings of the withdrawal of participation. Let's put it so.
Well, it is the point you made was interesting to me too, because you were talking about the ancient people not really seeing a difference between breath and wind and spirit, right? And there are those three. And I thought that was an interesting point, because it's like we do, for some reason, and I'm kind of the same way, it's like the more black and white, the more left brain I want to think. I want to divide things up. and
Right.
put them in categories. But now we kind of are at this point where it is like this evolution of consciousness, and it's like, no, those three are, but it's weird. It's a weird place where I still can keep the three separate, but unify them in one. They are coming back into one. And it's like, I do see the difference between wind and breath and spirit. Like they are in separate categories, but they aren't anymore. They're still coming back into like one greater category. So even on those little levels, I wonder if it was beneficial to us to, like, if those are falls in a sense, I guess, or something, where it's coming into, we're giving this own thing, it's almost its own identity, its own ego, and it's kind of these little patterns of falls or something, and now they're coming back into a unity or something like that.
Right. I
don't
think,
know
well,
if I
that's what it is. It's like the reintegration of unity after a hyper focus on multiplicity, right? So I think, which is why I referenced earlier, like there being a connection between what Barfield was saying and I think what Ian McGilchrist is talking about, although he tends to talk about it in the vernacular of left and right brain. And well, another evolution of consciousness thinker was Julian Jaynes, who wrote a book in the mid 70s about the origins of the bicameral mind, and he kind of saw it in the same way that McGilchrist does, but he actually thought that there was actually like a change to the brain itself, where that he thought that in earlier times there was more natural integration between the hemispheres of the brain, and that there had been a change in human consciousness. Barfield wrote a review of his book, which at the time, but and obviously he had some issues with it because Barfield thought it was still too mired in the kind of representations of the collective representations of the that are characteristic of the withdrawal of participation. But in any case,
I was thinking of something that I think, so one of my favorite poets is Liesl Mueller. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. I think she won the Pulitzer in 97. And she was a German immigrant who came to the United States shortly before World War II. Right. But she writes this poem that I think is actually really interesting, has something really interesting to say about final participation and the move from original to final participation. And it's called Monet Refuses the Operation. You mind if I read it quickly?
No, go for it.
Actually very illustrative of what we're talking about. So Monet refuses the operation. Doctor, you say there are no halos around the streetlights in Paris, and what I see is an aberration caused by old age, an affliction. I tell you, it has taken me all my life to arrive at the vision of gas lamps as angels, to soften and blur and finally banish the edges you regret I don't see, to learn that the line I called the horizon does not exist, and sky and water so long apart are the same state of being. 54 years before I could see the Rouen Cathedral is built of parallel shafts of sun, and now you want me to restore my youthful errors, fixed notions of top and bottom, the illusion of three-dimensional space, wisteria separate from the bridge it covers. What can I say to convince you the Houses of Parliament dissolve night after night to become the fluid dream of the Thames? I will not return to a universe of objects that don't know each other, as if islands were not the lost children of one great continent. The world is flux, and light becomes what it touches, becomes water, lilies on water, above and below water, becomes lilac and mauve and yellow and white cerulean lamps, small fists of passing sunlight so quickly, small fists passing sunlight so quickly to one another that it would take long streaming hair inside my brush to catch it, to paint at the speed of light. Our weighted shapes, these verticals, burn to mix with air, change our bones, skin, clothes to gases. Doctor, if you could only see how heaven pulls earth into its arms and how infinitely the heart expands to claim this world, blue vapor without end. So I think that that's a perfect illustration. That poem is like Monet refusing the operation on his eyes. He famously goes blind, right? And the doctor's trying to correct his vision, but he's saying, no, the things that you think that I need to draw these distinctions with are one piece. They're one being.
Have either of you read T.H. White's Once and Future King?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I have not.
So, okay. Have you seen The Sword and the Stone, the Disney movie?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you'll still get the concept. So Merlin, when he's trying to teach lessons to Arthur, he teaches him his lessons by transforming him into animals, or at least making him think that he's transformed himself into animals, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, so another way to think about this is through that kind of idea, and also the notion of shamanic transformation, because what that consciousness is that allows you to momentarily step outside of the I am that is merely the character whose story that you have in your head, and to actually inhabit something and erase that subject object line that we have within our observer consciousness, right? So it's like, instead of just observing the fish, I become the fish, and I begin to see through the fish's eyes. This is like Goethe, in his view, Goethe's pushing toward this in the Goethean view of the sciences, right? He's trying to push us beyond this subject object dualism, to start to see into what Vervaeke calls the transjective. So that's a really, really good way of thinking about the difference between a consciousness that's in withdrawal of participation and fully invested in it, that's stuck in that Cartesian dualism and that subject-object duality, and is actually pushing to the point where it's beginning to enter into final participation. The other really good illustration is, I don't know if either of you have read Piranesi by Susanna Clark, but like the title character in that book, like that is the consciousness of final participation, like right there in that novel. So I would say that if you really want to understand what's going on with Barfield's concepts of evolution of consciousness and what final participation is, you can do worse than read that novel. But I also think that the Arthur Merlin example is really concrete. But I have to make at least one Arthurian reference every episode because it's Grail Country.
Well, Jason, I mean, I'm curious for you, like, as we discuss this further, is just kind of the initial question that you've asked is like, do you see the evolution of consciousness connecting to theosis?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, because that's why I was interested in it, because man, I'm trying to think of the right ways to form my words here. Even you mentioning this before, maybe I don't know how this all tie in. The seeing yourself as the fish, like the King Arthur movie, seeing yourself as all these little animals, made me think of Ecclesiastes, and that's what verse popped in my head. I said in my heart, concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals. So that all creation is groaning, waiting for the revealing of the sons of God, right? It's waiting for this theosis moment. And so all creation is waiting for this.
And just as in Greek, the word has one, it's breath, spirit, wind, same in Hebrew, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's also we're choosing to translate it as breath, but in Hebrew that also means one spirit, one
Mm-hmm.
wind. So for the ancient consciousness, like the feeling of the wind on your skin would actually be an experience of feeling your connectedness to all life.
Yeah.
And there would be no separation conceptually of those things.
Yeah, so I do see it as this form of theosis, because I think that is maybe this entering into this whatever consciousness state, or if we can get there, of this being so consumed with love to where you perceive everything with love, I guess, and to where it draws all things together. And to me, that would be something like theosis. But maybe that's a wrong.
No, I think this is necessarily right, and I think this is why Tomberg keeps bringing it back to the prodigal, right? And he keeps using the story of the prodigal son as like as a primary way of looking at it, because that's the story.
Yeah. That popped into my head too earlier, actually, because you were mentioned, and we were talking even about the future progression, further up and further in, all that stuff. And I saw thrones and they sat on them and judgment was committed to him. And it's like, who gets to sit on the throne? It's the prodigal son, probably, because he's the one who loves much, right? He who is forgiven much loves much. And so it's that process of the fall, and then partaking of the forgiveness. It's like that, not that you have to sin the most, but if you can somehow hold that in your heart of just, or have this revelation of how much you've been forgiven, then it's like you're able to, or you're entrusted with the sword more, I guess. Like you're entrusted with the judgment a little better, because you know how to hold the mercy in the other hand at the same time.
But if the prodigals if the prodigals really learned anything in that process, then the prodigal would also be able to reintegrate the older brother within to his own story and bring healing.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And that's and that's why I think it just that image of the king becoming the martyr is just key. It's like, it's because that would pull your brother to you, if ever your brother, because even if your brother didn't want to come back into the fold and he wanted to stone you, it's like you just do what Stephen did. And then it's like you recognize the blindness of the world, and it's somehow that it takes the blame on yourself. You become the scapegoat instead of making the scapegoat of the other. And that still connects. It still like keeps some sort of weird like tethered line through forgiveness that just can never be unbroken or something. And so I don't know, just seeing that, to me, I think that's it. All is connected to theosis, to come into that sort of state of consciousness where it's not like truth dissolves and everything just becomes meaningless, but it's like it's hard for me to get the language around. But I think that is, once that is recognized, I think, in that form of theosis, then it's just further up and further in, and it's that spiral like you're talking about, and it's that not like the repeating cycle or something. I don't know if that's the wrong way to describe it, but that pattern of story like you're talking about that branches off and continues to create, I think, through that form. I don't know. That's my thoughts on it.
And even in that, so even in the Genesis text, right? The act of creation is also an act of drawing distinctions, right? Mm-hmm. Separating the light from the darkness, separating, drawing a distinction between the dry land and the sea. And there is that sense where in the process of creation, like things begin in that original and undifferentiated state, but then the distinctions have to be drawn. So you know what you're looking at, right? Because from the vantage point of the finite creation, like we need to see those distinctions to see what they are. But then there has to be kind of that apokatastasis, the return to the stasis.
Yeah.
That is inherent in the creative act, so that all of those distinctions still obtain within creation. All the difference in creation is still there. It's still very real, but its substructure is a fundamental unity, not a fundamental difference. And so I think that like when we're looking at what creation is it is that sense of that beginning in oneness, the beginning of stasis, but then the drawing of distinctions that allow the unfolding and the proliferation of creation itself, with all of the little parts that comprise it. Yeah. But that are ultimately unified in one singular source, which is God's own being.
Yeah.
Right. But in order for us to have a sense of our own individual identity, that distinction has to be drawn. It's just that that distinction then has to be also eclipsed, right? Has to rejoin the stasis at the other side of the horizon, where we see ourselves both as one and as many in one unified whole.
Yeah, I missed part of that, but that's exactly where my mind was going. Is like, we need to talk about, like, this comes down to talking about the problem of unity and multiplicity. And I would also say that everything we said in this conversation would point toward why there is ultimately no monistic resolution of that. Like, they have to exist in a polarity. They have to exist in a polarity. And which is why I think love is the only proper resolution of the problem of unity and multiplicity. And that's why that's why God is said to be love. And that God is by nature a multi-unity. And there is no, like, the absolute unity underlying everything also contains multiplicity.
Yeah, well, I think that comes like directly from just the divine nature itself, is the interplay between essence and person, right? There's already a dual expression, not necessarily a duality, but an expression, right, or a modal expression of unity is always going to involve the other.
It depends on how you mean duality. If you talk about, like, I think like if you look at what some of the things that Tomberg says in the letter of the High Priestess, I think you start to think about duality in kind of that way, or what McGilchrist is talking about when he talks about the ultimate nature of reality is a duality that is a non-duality that also contains duality.
Yeah, like a dialectical monism.
Right.
It's the one that's already many.
Correct.
And I think that goes into some of those debates that Nate and I are tracking some online.
But that points to why why evolution of consciousness at all. Like, why was there ever a move toward increased differentiation and a fall into more and more multiplicity in the first place?
Yeah.
Well, it's ultimately so that now you can see how God can say that this will ultimately yield something better or an increase in the end. And that's because it's even more of a reflection of that fundamental underlying nature of God, which I would say is a multi-unity to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those are good points to make. And yeah.
Sorry about the interruption. I had an employee call me an hour and 20 minutes after I got off work, so I thought it might, but he appears to have pocket dialed me.
Oh, okay.
Because I thought there was some kind of horrible emergency since I'd been off work for almost an hour and a half.
Yeah. Don't worry, mine's on silent, but it's been blowing up all day.
Yeah.
But I guess, okay, so I have one like final question in my mind just in this conversation. And it's more of a practical one. So, we've been talking about these concepts of participation and consciousness and those kinds of things. And Jason, you brought up like this really like one of the most beautiful passages in scripture there in Romans 8 about the groaning of creation, eagerly waiting the revelation of the sons of God, right? I'll make a statement, then ask the question. But what I've seen in like kind of watching like online discourse unfold over maybe the last 10 years is a lot of these concepts were around. I mean, Barfield was writing about them, 50 years ago, and these are not new concepts, but they've entered into the Christian lexicon in a way that has just not been broadly available until like we started talking to each other about these ideas. But as we think through the question of like participation, we think through the question of consciousness. And I think as we think through what our obligation is as Christians in the world, like how do these concepts take on real life in the world? Like what do we do? That's my question.
part of me thinks we're at least these, I should say this little quarter of the internet is already doing it. Because I think God, it was because I just recently listened to it because I was trying to, Cal sent me a video of both of you, like kind of your backstories where you shared it. So I was trying to listen to it before this. But you were the one, Jed, you were talking to Luke and you said, he mentioned martyrdom and you said it's not just like physical martyrdom. And so I think to me, I think that's probably the closest I can imagine it is, even in these conversations, all these conversations we're having, every like theological debate or whatever, people are coming with their ideas, but then it's like the ideas are the yeah, it's hard to say. I used to be, okay, so maybe I can get it this way. I used to be very, 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 very hardline on truth. And I just thought truth was like the best idea, like highest ideal to aim for. And then someone pointed out to me, they're like, well, Jesus is the truth and he died on the cross. Like God killed him, like sort of thing. Like it's like he put him on the cross. And it's like that form of love. It's like where the king becomes the martyr. And so every idea we're coming into with these things, it's like we're somehow not losing them, but they're making that leap from the going up all the way to the throne. You have your idea, you have your theological debate, whatever your discussion, you have your king, you have, and then all these, I'm seeing it happen in these conversations where it's like people are, all those things are making these leaps and becoming the martyr, and they're kind of like going into this, I'm talking this weird language, I know this isn't helpful, and they're kind of going to this heavenly realm. It is literally, it feels to me like I'm watching the revealing of the sons of God, like on like in this outskirts, and it's like on the outskirts of the church where people aren't even willing to they're still unsure whether they can define themselves as Christians. When I ask one of these people, are you a Christian, they're like, I don't know what really defines that. And it's like,
well, I think, yeah, I know, I think you're really like you're warmer than I think you realize you are. And I think what you're saying connects to what was said earlier about this idea of making space, because I think that there's a connection between this idea of martyrdom and the idea of making space. So I think that's what the call is to make space.
yeah, it's, I mean, it's hard for me to put into words because I just feel like it happens fractally. I mean, it happens, I even like embodying it, like you're talking about, Jed, it seems like it's just it happens in so many small ways and large ways, where Paul says, I die daily. It's like it's this dying daily is this progression into theosis or life or something like that. And it's in a weird way where it's like, it's not that you abandon truth, it's just that, I mean, because Christ rises again, you know, he becomes a martyr, but it's like he rises again. It's not like the truth, the way the truth and the life is just obliterated and forgotten. It's like it just transcends at that point. I don't know the right language to get at, but it seems like that.
But what when Paul says I die daily, what I do you think he's talking about?
Probably the left brain type thing. The all of that. Which I think, I mean, I think it's the same thing like with the prodigal son too. He was dead and he becomes alive again. He goes and he lives his own life. He becomes himself. He's in this self-identifying mode, and then he comes back and he's dead. He realizes he kind of dies again, comes back and is willing to fall at his father's feet. So I think it's in all those ways. It's all those. I mean, I think it just seems to be that has to happen in order to include the other. It's like I keep saying,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I there's a couple of things I wanted to just draw some connections that you're saying. Like, so in Paul, like, I think that the question of the I that he's talking about, right? If you go into Galatians, what is it, 2:20, that I've been crucified with Christ and it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, right? Mm-hmm. If you want to reduce that down to kind of a simple formula of what Paul's saying, is the I that is not I is me, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The I that has to get crucified with Christ is so that I'm no longer
Right.
I,
I
become
see.
me.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Okay,
who
yeah,
is
yeah.
me? Who is me? Well, me is Christ in me, right?
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah,
the egoic principle gives way to a unified and a participatory, I guess you could say, ego, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
no, it
yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
but the I
That's
becomes
that's
a different kind of I by
yeah,
letting go of itself. But as that connects to the
Exactly.
idea of martyrdom, and I think it's really important, is like martyr is, simply our word for witness,
Right. Exactly.
bearing witness, that it's through faithful testimony, right? And testimony, like valid testimony in the court of law, is not the testimony that forecloses all possibilities for all other truth claims. It's credible witness. Is this witness honest? Is it bearing
Well,
faith witness is the honest witness of the way I see it, at least, is that faithful testimony has kind of at least two different modes of, this is what I perceive, what Christ's work on my behalf means to me, right? And so sharing your story, right? But also being able to embed that in the larger story of, this is what Christ's work on the cross means for all things. So bearing witness in those two modes to the particular and the universal.
let me put this at a more basic level though, Judd. How useful as a witness is someone who is blind and deaf?
Yeah, you have to be able
So
to.
there's a prerequisite to be a witness.
Yeah. Yeah, the prerequisite is that you have seen and heard.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Mhm. That's good.
And
Yeah, I'm glad you said all that.
and I think that's what, like, the kind of the inner logic of John's apocalypse is pointing us to, is the undoing of kind of Isaiah's formula of seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, right?
Mhm.
Is that when the eyes are opened and the ears are opened and the heart is open to the creative work that God is accomplishing in Christ, there is a shift in the consciousness, or at least the shift is available to us. When you remove it outside of just the realm of doctrinal abstraction, and I think that's where a lot of like the withdrawal of participation has kind of left us, to where
Yep.
what our relationship with God is functionally in the modern world is a set of associations with a set of ideas that we call doctrine, which is not really participation in the living presence of Christ, which requires something that, and I don't think I do a good job of this personally, so this is just me talking, but also probably correcting myself as I'm talking, is it's not just getting into the abstract possibilities of what doctrinal language is, but it's an abiding, living, presencing kind of reality that actually leaves us affected, so that you can bear witness. And I think that's what was happening, like in the early churches. They were gripped by this miraculous outpouring that was coming in and through Christ, post Pentecost, through the work of the Spirit. It was this unmistakable, almost like this ecstatic outpouring of a new reality.
Well, and to bear witness is to talk about what you have directly experienced.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not just I've read about this guy, but like I've encountered this as a living reality.
Right.
And I think that, like, that's maybe to me, maybe at least an area that I hope for Christians in general, is that we can, I'm not saying abandon the doctrinal language or abandon, good sound reasoning, but like alongside of that, like, because you don't lose what you've developed in that withdrawal participation. That observer consciousness is important, and you don't lose that when you move into the next stage of consciousness, right? So the distinctions are important, but a willingness to bear witness based on a living encounter. And like, if we're not really encountering God in Christ, then we're doing is we're adding to the that abstract world of doctrine, right? And it just becomes something that we fight over,
Right.
ultimately. And
And,
I think
which
that
is,
we have to move beyond that.
and the subtitle of Barfield's Saving the Appearances is a study in idolatry. And that's a subtitle for a region, because precisely the kind of religious thinking that it leads to is idolatry. It's an idolatry that is rooted in abstractions and propositional reasoning instead of carvings of wood and stone.
Yeah, it's an abstract idolatry. Still idolatry though. And I think like that's the golden calf is a great illustration of that, right? By all indications, it would appear that like in the construction of the golden calf, that Israel thought they were worshiping the one God, right? They weren't positing another God. It's just that their concept of who God was inadequate for the revelation that was happening at Sinai, right?
Yeah.
And like we build those, we don't construct physical idols these
There's
days.
some rabbinical commentary on that particular portion of the text that tries to play apologist for Aaron, and suggesting that that it was actually like Egyptians who were amongst the Hebrews who came up with the idea, and that there was some sort of like implied pressure for him to do it and all that kind of thing.
Sure. And it doesn't change much. Like their picture was the wrong picture.
Yeah.
Right. And so, it was like, it was a false representation. Right. And like, I think we run the risk of that even in our doctrinal abstractions, right? Is that we can reduce God to a set of abstractions and not
Which is
a
like building the
genuine
calf.
living presence that we've encountered.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think
Yeah.
that that's like where, to circle back around to the question I asked, I do think that like the real shift and the real change and the real revealing of the sons of glory comes from that real encounter. Like here on the far side of history, here after having learned the lessons that history has taught us, is to kind of that return to the source and knowing it again for the first time.
Yeah. I think that's, I don't think I might like get hurt. I'm glad you said all that too. I don't think I am articulating myself that well at all in this conversation, but I think that's what I feel like we're kind of coming to with the evolution of consciousness too. It's like this. Yeah, it's not just a doctrinal understanding of Christ. It's not, because then it just turns into some
Right.
form of almost like a Gnosticism or something. But it's like, it's a really understanding what all he embodies and what it means when it says he's the Son of God. And it's like actually, well, not just understanding it, but actually having it, impact you, because you can understand it in small levels and in large levels. And it's like, but the further I actually try to think about it, it's just like, even if I were, I don't think I could abandon Christ if I wanted to now, because it's like, it is such a, it's all of reality to me at this point. Because the further I dig into it, it's like, if you actually want to go through deconstruction, it's like that. Fine, if you actually are honest with it, you're gonna find Christ at the bottom.
Right.
And so it's like of everything. And so it's just it, and just not just like, that may sound weird to some people, but it's just everything he embodies, like the idea, everything he embodies of God's forgiveness, the king becoming the martyr, of love. And it is love. It's just sometimes it's hard to use that word because of just how much is thrown around now these days. I'm like, I wish there was a better, a more impactful way of saying it, but it is love. And I think really tasting of it, the theosis part of it feels like, I always have that image of Mary pouring out the oil on the feet of Jesus. That's kind of the image I get of theosis, or her at the tomb weeping or something like that. Trying to think of the right way to describe it. Like, those are the pictures that come to mind. But the hardest scripture I think for me to wrestle with, I know I'm sounding really scattered, so I'm going to try to tie it in, is when Paul said, I could wish myself accursed for my brethren in the flesh. And I think that to me is getting at theosis. It's that sort of idea. When Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. And then it's like, do you just carry your cross or do you actually get on it, type of thing? Like, do you, cursed is every man who hangs on a tree. So are you willing to be cursed for your brethren? It's like, that to me is kind of what it gets at, where there's, where you're willing to go to hell for your brother next to you. And it's like, that doesn't do away with truth. Because if you did away with truth, then there would just be no hell. But it's like, no, there's still this thing we're holding to, this idea, this good, this ultimate good we're striving for it, but I'm willing to lay down my life for my brother. And I think it seems like that's, at least I'm seeing it more. I don't know. It seems like it's becoming more real in the world. But then at the same time, there's also this crazy amount of chaos that's just like, I don't know. That's what I mean. It's like certain circles, it seems like it's real. And I can see that, like kind of that spirit happening in certain areas, in pockets, but then at the same time, it's just like massive amounts of chaos happening. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's the story within the story. Which one's the real story? Is the chaos the real story? Or is it simply just the background through which creation is emerging? Right. And it's the setting through which the new thing is coming. And in some senses, the chaos of our time is an inevitability. Like, it's going to be chaotic. That is, where we are, find ourselves in the middle of a disordered and chaotic cosmos, right? And that word from God is what brings order into the chaos, which brings light into the darkness. And learning to be that kind of embodied word, a word of the word, a further explication of being a little Christ, being a Christian, is the point.
Being an I am who can say I am and know what it means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not just associate it with some story that you've told yourself.
Yeah.
That is a story of your ego. Not saying I can do that, because the process of theosis is nowhere near complete for me, but I can say conceptually that's what it would represent, was being able to understand the true mystery of those words and what they really mean, and what they disclose about the nature of reality.
Yeah. The thing I said with Mary too, I don't know if I tied that in, but the part is that she says this is for, he says, leave her alone. She has done this for my burial. And she pours it on his body. I think it says, so it's like, we are the body of Christ type thing. We're being anointed for burial type of thing.
Right.
That's to me kind of what it is.
Well, and that's it. Okay. Thank you. Because you brought up like it's been on the tip of my tongue. I think so that that new song, that possibility of new creation, like, you have to be willing to lose.
Yes.
Right. So many people are focused on winning history. Right.
Yeah.
How does Jesus win? He lost.
Yep.
He lost.
Yeah.
Surrender.
Like, in terms of like his messianic mission by every worldly standard was a failure. Right. And I think that like bearing faithful witness in that nonviolent mode that we're called to in Revelation, overcoming not with the sword, but by the word of our testimony, is the willingness to lose. But also that willingness to lose, that also is the firm assurance of our hope of that new world, and the articulation and the explanation and the unfolding of its possibility. It takes on reality as we confess it, but you have to be willing to lose. And too many Christians are used to this idea that we can march triumphantly through history. Christ's triumphal entry terminates at the cross. That's where that journey takes him. That is his triumph. And that's our triumph too, which means you have to be willing to lose. And I think that like so much of like, if you look at like Christian engagement in the culture wars, Why are we trying to win that fight? Why aren't you willing? Why
Yeah.
aren't we willing to lose that fight? Like
Yeah.
we overcome the world in our martyrdom, not in our triumph over it.
Mhm.
That is not something that there are going to be a lot of people that simply cannot accept what you just said.
I think, do you think the pushback against that is because they think it's just you're laying down and being walked over? Because to me, it appears quite the opposite. I don't know why the push against
I
it
think
is.
it's a fundamental sense that it's fragile, like that somehow like the Christian reality is a fragile one. It's indestructible.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
You can lose. It can suffer every loss
And
because
it
it
comes back from the grave. Like, yeah.
Right. It
Yeah,
suffers
that's
every
what
loss. It suffers every injury. It suffers every evil, and it still comes back. So to
Yeah.
have some confidence that like, people worry about, well, what's going to become of the church in future generations? Like, why are you worried about that? Christ
Right.
created this.
Well,
thing.
that's, why, obviously you're gonna get no pushback from me on that, Jed, because ultimately you just gave the answer as to why I'm a Christian anarchist. That's why I'm a Christian anarchist. Because like those political fights aren't worth fighting.
Because it's
They're
already,
not worth fighting.
because even if you win, you've lost.
Correct.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Because you had to defeat somebody.
right. And you can't,
Yeah.
there's no way to politically love your enemies. Politics is actually depends upon having enemies and treating them as enemies. Necessarily, and at least, and here's what I'll say this: at least the truly reactionary right is at least intellectually honest about that, and will admit that that's the case.
Oh man, I fight it so much. I mean, I know that as like somebody who's pretty darn progressive, almost across the board in my views, is like I still fall into that binary zero sum kind of thinking.
Of course you do.
The kingdom is not zero sum.
Right. Because, well, I mean, it tells you that it's the world, right? It's the world. So that should tell you something about the inescapability of falling into the trap of thinking in its terms. Right. And I'm not invulnerable to doing that either, but that doesn't mean that, but nonetheless, I'm capable of realizing that when I do so, that I've fallen into error.
Yeah.
Right.
And I try not to at least double down on my error when I see that happening.
Yeah. Well, but and Christ does some interesting things with that. He comes from that heavenly perspective, but he also comes on into the earth to bring a sword and to bring the fire, and to draw those distinctions and to separate things into stark relief. Right. And so I think like there is a sense of like contending in the world that we all invariably do one way or the other anyway. But if that's not done within an overall context that is non-zero sum, that is about dividing the sheep from the goats and the winners and the losers, so to speak.
Well, I also think that's about like the unveiling of what exactly it is that we're up against. I think that's like part of what it is not it's just announcing the inevitability of what will happen as that unveiling occurs.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to, like, speaking the truth about those things isn't going to win you any friends or influence anyone.
Well, because you can't leverage power, like
Right.
you can't leverage, it's not leverageable.
Right.
Right. You can't put, the usual set of carrots and sticks that we use to motivate people.
That's why it brings the sword, because the world inevitably must resist it. So it's not bringing the sword in sense of, okay, I'm bringing the sword now, you're going to get it. It's bringing the sword in that if you think and speak and witness to these realities, the sword will come.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
What
So
it's interesting, that kind of gets into what do you guys think about that? The book of Revelation, the imagery in there is often more of the sword coming, the judgment, the
Right.
hammer coming down from heaven, the fire coming from heaven, I guess you could say. What do you think is the cause of that? Is it the martyrdom, the witness type thing is the
I-
cause?
I'm going to invite people to stay tuned to
Okay,
future
all right.
installments of our
Of your
discussion
conversation.
of
All
our
right.
discussion of Bulgakov's Apocalypse of John.
But to
We'll
answer
definitely-
your question,
we'll definitely talk
Jason,
about
yes.
Okay, all right, all right, all
Okay,
right.
darn it.
I'm definitely going to stay tuned then, because I'm really interested in this. I've had this idea in the back of my head for a long time, and it's extremely unpopular when I bring it up to Christians, but it's kind of gets along those lines. I don't want to go into it. I'll wait for your video or whatever. I'll leave comments, but I think it's probably going to be line up with what you guys are going to say, I guess.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if you got a copy of it, like, would jump in and have a conversation with us on it.
Yeah,
So,
we've been invited. We've given an open invitation to anybody who wants to dive
Okay.
into it with us. So
Nice.
Yeah.
What's the book again?
it's Bulgakov's Revelation commentary. I don't have it handy, but
Spell
yeah,
that for me again.
it's
Sure.
it's the
Give me a second.
Apocalypse of John, an essay in dogmatic interpretation by Sergei Bulgakov.
Okay, I'll try to
And
find
it
that
is
on Amazon.
last time I checked, it was going for there's the cover right there.
yeah.
Oh, wait,
Last time
sorry,
I
let me-
checked, it was going for about $56. Jed paid 90 when
Okay.
he got it. I got it for 70. It seems to be trending down
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
for the moment.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I can find it. All right, I'll look
Yep.
for it. but-
Okay.
Yeah, and there's
All
anyway, yeah, it's something worth discussing, but these are kind of, I mean, in terms of, I think where Nate and I are probably most aligned is on these issues, the importance of kind of exploring these topics, because I
Yeah,
think that they are really timely. And it's like, I don't think either of us have any pretensions to our own importance. It's just that, lending our voice to it and bearing witness from our own little place here,
Yeah.
it's like in a world that's kind of turning itself upside down, it feels like this is one of the only things we can do,
yeah.
I mean, and
Yeah.
I do think that the time will be coming when there is more to be done. As the world enters into kind of some more critical moments, it will create opportunities for not just Christians, but all of God's children to step up.
Yeah.
And to call forth a new reality that is already the reality.
And
that
there's always a place for witness.
So
I'll keep doing it, man. This Grail
Yeah.
Country podcast, it is.
Thank
good.
you.
It's
Thank
good
you.
stuff, man. It is. I was thinking that the other day. I'm like, man, a lot of podcasts I can come across. It feels like they're grabbing at this thing or that thing. A lot of like useful tools they'll be getting at, but it's just like something about like if you're going after the Grail, there's just something deeper. There's like a deeper level where you guys are really digging into. I almost say it seems like a lot of times you're digging into the trying to get at the heart of everything. So
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And in a way, a Grail Country Grail Country could be considered a theory of everything podcast.
yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for talking to me, guys. Thanks so much for taking the time. That's been great. So
well, yeah, it was great having you. It was great having you.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us.
yeah, well, I'll
Right.
stay tuned for sure.
Okay.
I'll try to look. I'll look for that book too if I can find it. I don't know. So
All right.
yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Jason, with your very, very interesting question that we were happy to engage with you on today.
Yeah.
All right.
you're welcome. Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks for having me. See ya. Have a good night.
Yep. Bye-bye.